1944. A young German soldier stepped off the ship in America, bracing himself for the brutal punishment Nazi propaganda had promised: starvation, torture, maybe death. Instead, what he saw in his first 24 hours as a prisoner of war would shatter everything he'd been taught to believe, leaving him questioning whether he'd been fighting for the right side all along. But what could possibly be so shocking about an American POW camp that it would make a loyal Wehrmacht soldier doubt the very cause he was willing to die for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the winter of 1943, Germany was a nation consumed by war. Every city, every town, every village felt the iron grip of total conflict. The Nazi government under Adolf Hitler had transformed the entire country into one massive war machine. Factories that once made toys now made bullets. Farms that once fed families now sent every spare potato to the army. Nothing existed that did not serve the war effort. The propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels filled the radio waves with speeches promising victory. Giant posters covered bombed buildings, showing strong German soldiers crushing weak enemies. The message was everywhere and always the same: Germany was superior, Germany would win. And Germany's enemies were barely human. German civilians lived under conditions that grew worse with each passing month. Food rations shrank until families survived on dark bread made with sawdust, thin soup with floating bits of turnip, and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted acorns that tasted like bitter dirt. Real coffee had become a distant memory. Butter was something grandparents told stories about. Meat appeared on tables perhaps once a month, and even then, it was often horse or worse. Clothing was patched and repatched until the original fabric disappeared under layers of repairs. Shoes were resoled with wood or cardboard. Women stood in lines for hours hoping to buy anything at all. At night, cities went completely dark. No streetlights glowed. No house showed a single candle. The blackout rules were absolute because British and American bombers flew overhead, dropping destruction from the sky. The German economy had been stripped bare to feed the war. Factories ran day and night, powered by slave labor from conquered nations. Jewish people, Polish prisoners, Russian captives, and anyone else the Nazis deemed inferior were worked to death making weapons. Real materials had been replaced by substitutes. Rubber came from synthetic factories. Gasoline was stretched with additives. Even the coins in people's pockets were made of cheap zinc instead of proper metal. Money itself meant little when there was nothing to buy. The black market flourished in dark alleys where desperate people traded family heirlooms for a pound of real butter or a pair of children's shoes. Every German soldier grew up breathing in Nazi ideology like poisoned air. From the time they were small children in school, they learned that Germans were the master race, the Bermensch. They were taught that Slavic people were subhuman. They learned that Jewish people were parasites to be eliminated. They were told that Americans were weak, lazy, and racially impure. The propaganda described America as a nation torn apart by conflict between races, a place where gangsters ruled the streets and the economy was collapsing. German soldiers believed that American troops were undisciplined, that they could not fight, that they would break and run at the first sign of real battle. The Wehrmacht training officers hammered this message home again and again. One German soldier was worth 10 Americans. Hans Fischer was 22 years old when he was captured. He had joined the Wehrmacht at 18, full of pride and certainty. His father had been a postal worker in Hamburg before the war. His mother sewed clothes for neighbors to earn extra rations. He had one younger sister who worked in a munitions factory, her hands stained yellow from the chemicals. Hans had been sent to North Africa with Rommel's forces, then later to France. He had seen friends die. He had gone days without proper food. He had marched until his boots fell apart and his feet bled. But he believed. He believed in the cause, in the Führer, in the promised 1,000-year Reich. When the Americans captured him after the D-Day invasion in the summer of 1944, Hans was exhausted beyond measure. He had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. His uniform was stiff with dirt and dried sweat. A piece of shrapnel had cut his left arm, and the wound had become infected, swollen and hot to the touch. He expected to be shot immediately. The propaganda had told him that Americans executed prisoners. But instead, an American medic treated his wound, gave him water, and handed him a cigarette. Hans was too tired to make sense of it. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean took 2 weeks on a crowded Liberty ship. Hans was packed into the hold with hundreds of other German prisoners. They slept on narrow bunks stacked 3 high. The ship rolled in the waves, making many men sick. They whispered to each other in the darkness, sharing fears and rumors. Some said the Americans were taking them to slave labor camps in mines. Others said they would be used as human shields in the Pacific fighting against Japan. A few said they would simply be thrown overboard once the ship reached deep water. Hans said nothing. He was too numb, too defeated, too confused by everything that had happened. As the ship approached the American coast, Hans climbed up to the deck for the first time in days. It was early morning, and a guard had allowed a few prisoners up for fresh air. The American shoreline appeared through the mist. Hans squinted at it, trying to understand what he was seeing. There were no ruins. The building stood tall and complete. Lights twinkled in windows even though it was barely dawn. As the ship moved closer to the harbor, Hans saw cars moving on roads, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. In Germany, civilian cars had almost disappeared, their fuel and parts taken for military use. Here they moved freely, as if there was no war at all. The ship docked, and prisoners were led down the gangway in lines. Hans stepped onto American soil, expecting to see the devastation that German propaganda had promised. He expected bombed factories, hungry crowds, soldiers everywhere enforcing martial law. Instead, he saw a city that looked impossibly whole. Children played on a sidewalk near the dock. A woman walked past carrying shopping bags that looked heavy with goods. A man in civilian clothes laughed at something his companion said. Nobody looked afraid. Nobody looked hungry. The buildings had glass in their windows. The streets were clean and paved smoothly. Hans felt something crack inside his chest, a small fracture in the certainty he had carried since childhood. A single thought pushed through his exhaustion, a question he had never dared to ask before. If America looked like this, if America was this strong and whole while fighting a war on 2 sides of the world, what did that mean about everything he had been told? The train ride from the coast took 3 days, carrying Hans and 200 other German prisoners deep into the American heartland. They traveled through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and finally into Mississippi, where pine trees stretched endlessly on both sides of the tracks. Hans pressed his face against the window, watching America roll past. He saw farms so vast they seemed to have no end, with massive machines crawling across fields doing the work of 100 men. He saw small towns where every house had electric lights blazing, even during the day, as if electricity cost nothing at all. He saw highways filled with trucks carrying goods, and he wondered how America could have so many vehicles when Germany had stripped every civilian car for parts years ago. The other prisoners whispered among themselves, but Hans stayed silent, watching and trying to understand. Camp Shelby in Mississippi became Hans's new home. The camp sat in a clearing surrounded by forests, with rows of wooden barracks painted a dull green. Watchtowers stood at each corner, and a tall fence enclosed the entire area. Guards walked the perimeter carrying rifles, but they did not look cruel or angry. Some of them even smiled and nodded at the prisoners. On his first day, Hans was processed through an intake building where an officer checked his name against a list, took his photograph, and gave him clean clothes. The clothes were American military cast-offs, but they were whole, with no holes or patches. They were cleaner than anything Hans had worn in 2 years. Then came the first meal, and Hans understood that nothing he had been told was true. The prisoners were led into a mess hall where long tables waited. American soldiers served food from behind a counter, piling it onto metal trays. Hans held out his tray and watched in stunned silence as a soldier gave him 3 thick slices of white bread. Real butter in a small paper cup, a portion of roast beef as big as his fist, boiled potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans, and a cup of coffee. There was a slice of apple pie for dessert. Hans carried his tray to a table and sat down, staring at the food. Around him, other prisoners were equally silent, equally shocked. One man began to cry quietly. Another laughed, a strange broken sound. Hans picked up the white bread and held it close to his face, smelling it. In Germany, his mother had not seen white flour in more than a year. The bread they ate at home was dark and dense, mixed with sawdust to make the flour stretch further. This bread was soft and light, so white it almost glowed. He spread the butter on it with shaking hands. Real butter. He had forgotten what real butter tasted like. The roast beef was tender and rich with fat. The potatoes were hot and smooth. The coffee was real, not the bitter acorn mixture he had drunk for years. He ate slowly, trying to make it last, but his stomach cramped from months of poor food and he could not finish everything. After the meal, Hans watched an American guard scrape leftover food into a large trash bin. Entire slices of bread went into the garbage. Half-eaten portions of meat disappeared into the waste. Hans felt something twist inside him, a mixture of rage and disbelief. In Germany, throwing away bread was almost a crime. Children were taught that wasting food was a sin against the nation. His sister would work a 12-hour shift at the munitions factory and come home to eat thin soup with a single potato floating in it. Here, in an enemy prison camp, food was so abundant that leftovers were simply thrown away. The routine of camp life brought more shocks. Every week, the prisoners received rations that exceeded what German soldiers got at the front lines. Breakfast included eggs, bacon, toast, and milk. Lunch brought sandwiches made with real meat and cheese. Dinner offered a variety, sometimes chicken, sometimes pork, sometimes beef, always with vegetables and bread and coffee. Some prisoners began to gain weight rapidly. A man named Klaus, who had been skeletal when he arrived, put on 25 pounds in 2 months. His cheeks filled out and color returned to his face. Hans himself felt his strength returning, his infected arm healing cleanly under the care of camp doctors who treated him the same way they would treat an American soldier. Work assignments came after the first week. Hans was sent to work on a nearby farm that grew cotton and vegetables. An American guard drove him and 10 other prisoners to the farm in a truck each morning and picked them up each evening. The farm was owned by a man named Mr. Johnson, who was old and kind, his face wrinkled from years in the sun. He showed them what to do but never yelled or hit them. At midday, his wife brought lunch to the fields, thick sandwiches, cold lemonade, and cookies still warm from the oven. She smiled at the prisoners and said hello in broken German she had learned from a phrase book. One afternoon, a delivery truck arrived at the farm, painted bright red with white letters that read Coca-Cola. The driver unloaded cases of glass bottles filled with dark fizzing liquid. Mr. Johnson called the prisoners over and handed each man a bottle, using a metal opener to pop off the caps. Hans had never tasted Coca-Cola. The sweetness exploded on his tongue, the bubbles tickling his nose. It was cold from ice, impossibly cold in the Mississippi heat. He drank it slowly, savoring every sip. This was a luxury product, something created purely for pleasure. And it was being given to prisoners while German civilians drank acorn coffee and considered themselves lucky. In the evenings, Hans began keeping a diary in a small notebook he had traded cigarettes for. He wrote in tiny letters to save paper, filling page after page with observations. He wrote about the abundance, the waste, the kindness of guards who chatted with prisoners about baseball and their families back home. He wrote about the American guard named Schmidt, whose grandparents had come from Bavaria in 1890, whose family now owned a successful bakery in Ohio. This challenged everything Hans had learned about racial purity and the superiority of the German bloodline. How could a German family prosper in America if Americans were weak and inferior? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Other prisoners noticed the same things. During recreation time, when they were allowed to play soccer or cards, conversations turned serious and quiet. A former school teacher named Werner spoke in whispers about what they were seeing. He said the industrial capacity of America was beyond anything Germany could match. He said freedom and abundance created strength, not weakness. Some prisoners grew angry at such talk, remaining loyal to Nazi ideology, but others listened with troubled faces. Hans listened and said little, but inside his mind, the cracks were spreading wider. Everything he had believed, everything he had been willing to die for, was crumbling like a building with a weak foundation. And he did not know what would be left when it finally collapsed. Christmas arrived at Camp Shelby in December of 1944. And with it came the moment that would shatter Hans Fischer completely. The camp commanders had decided to allow the German prisoners to celebrate their traditional holiday, and preparations began a week in advance. Guards strung electric lights around the mess hall, something that would have been impossible in Germany, where every bit of electricity went to war factories. Prisoners were allowed to cut down small pine trees from the surrounding forest and decorate them with paper ornaments they made in craft sessions. The smell of pine filled the barracks, reminding Hans of childhood Christmases that now felt like they belonged to a different world. A different life entirely. On Christmas Eve, the prisoners were led into the mess hall wearing their cleanest clothes. What Hans saw made him stop in the doorway, unable to move forward. The tables were covered with white cloths and laden with food in quantities that seemed impossible. There were roasted turkeys, golden brown and glistening with fat, so many that Hans counted 12 of them lined up on the serving tables. There were baked hams studded with cloves, their surfaces glazed and shining. Mountains of mashed potatoes sat in huge bowls with butter melting into golden pools on top. Platters held stuffing, green beans swimming in butter, candied yams topped with browned marshmallows, fresh rolls, cranberry sauce that gleamed like rubies, and corn that actually tasted sweet. At the end of the table sat pies, dozens of them, apple and pumpkin and pecan, their crusts perfectly browned. Hans sat down at a table with Klaus and Werner and several other prisoners. Nobody spoke at first. They simply stared at the abundance before them. When the guards gave permission to begin, Hans filled his plate carefully, almost reverently. The turkey was moist and tender, nothing like the tough stringy meat he remembered from rare occasions in Germany. The mashed potatoes were creamy and rich. The sweet potatoes tasted like candy. He ate slowly, trying to memorize every flavor, every texture. Around him, grown men wept openly as they ate. Some cried from joy at tasting real food. Others cried from shame, understanding what this meal meant. After dinner, the guards distributed small packages that had arrived from the International Red Cross. Hans opened his with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter from his mother, written 2 months earlier. Her handwriting was shaky and difficult to read. She wrote about the cold winter, about how they had no coal for heating and slept wearing every piece of clothing they owned. She wrote about eating turnips for 17 days straight because nothing else was available. She described how his sister Maria had fainted at the munitions factory from hunger and exhaustion. She wrote that Maria's shoes had fallen apart completely, and she had wrapped her feet in newspaper and cloth to walk to work through the snow. His mother ended the letter saying she prayed for him every night and hoped he was safe. that she dreamed of the day when he would come home and they could share a simple meal of bread and soup together. Hans folded the letter and placed it carefully in his pocket. Then he stood up and walked out of the mess hall into the cold December night. He walked past the guards who watched him, but did not stop him, understanding perhaps that some men needed to be alone. He walked to the edge of the camp where the fence met the tree line, and he stood there in the darkness, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear Mississippi sky. His hands gripped the fence wire until his knuckles went white. The thoughts came in a flood that he could not stop. He had just eaten a meal fit for a king while his mother and sister starved in Hamburg. The Americans were feeding their enemies better than the German government fed its own loyal citizens. The abundance here was so great that guards threw away food every single day while his family wrapped their feet in newspaper. The factories he had seen from the train window, the cars on every road, the electric lights blazing wastefully, the Coca-Cola delivered to a farm for prisoners to drink, all of it pointed to one terrible truth. Germany had never stood a chance. The propaganda had been lies, all of it, every single word. Hans had been taught that Americans were weak because their society was free and diverse. He had been taught that only through rigid control and racial purity could a nation become strong. But everything he saw proved the opposite. America was strong precisely because it was free. The abundance came from a system that worked, that allowed people to build and create and prosper. Germany's system was built on lies and theft and murder, and it had led only to destruction and starvation and death. He had been ready to die for the Führer, to sacrifice everything for the Reich. Now he saw that he had been ready to die for nothing. For a mad dream that could never work, for leaders who cared nothing about their own people. Inside the mess hall, the prisoners had been given permission to sing traditional Christmas carols. Hans could hear their voices drifting out into the night, singing Silent Night in German, the same song his family had sung together before the war destroyed everything. He leaned his forehead against the cold fence wire and finally let himself feel the full weight of understanding. His nation had committed terrible crimes. He had heard whispers, rumors of what happened in the camps in Poland, of mass killings, of horrors beyond imagination. He had told himself the rumors were enemy propaganda. Now he knew they were probably true, because everything else had been a lie. So why not that too? Werner found him there an hour later. The old teacher stood beside Hans in silence for a long moment before speaking quietly. Werner said that this was what a free society could build, that this was what Germany had tried to destroy in its pursuit of an insane dream. He said the hardest thing a man could do was admit he had been wrong about everything, but that admitting it was the only way to become something better. He said they had been fed lies since childhood, and those lies had poisoned their entire nation. But seeing the truth now meant they could choose differently going forward. That night, Hans wrote in his diary by the light of a small lamp in the barracks. His handwriting was messy because his hands shook. He wrote that today he understood everything. America had not defeated Germany through cruelty or luck. America had defeated Germany because their system worked, and the Nazi system was built on lies from the very foundation. He had been willing to die for the Führer. Now he saw he had been willing to die for nothing at all, for a murderous fantasy that brought only suffering. He wrote that he no longer knew who he was or what he believed, but he knew what he did not believe anymore. He would never again accept easy answers or beautiful lies. He would never again let someone else do his thinking for him. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, but Hans Fischer did not go home. The American authorities kept German prisoners in camps for many months after the surrender, using them as workers while the military processed millions of displaced people and began the enormous task of rebuilding the shattered continent. Hans was sent to work on farms in Iowa, where he earned small wages that he saved carefully. He worked beside American farmers who treated him fairly, who shared their lunch with him, who taught him better farming methods than he had ever seen in Germany. He learned about crop rotation and soil conservation and machinery that could do the work of 50 men. The farmers asked him about Germany, about his family, about what he believed now. Hans answered honestly, saying he no longer knew what he believed except that lies had poisoned his entire nation and only truth could heal it. In the spring of 1947, nearly 2 years after the war ended, Hans finally received orders for repatriation. He boarded a transport ship in New York Harbor, along with hundreds of other German prisoners who were going home at last. His small bag contained American work clothes that had been given to him, a baseball glove that a farmer's son had taught him to use, chocolate bars he had saved for his sister, cigarettes that would be worth more than money in ruined Germany, and his diary wrapped in oilcloth and hidden at the bottom beneath everything else. The diary contained 3 years of observations and thoughts that could get him killed if the wrong people read it, but he could not leave it behind. It was the record of his transformation, the proof that he had learned something valuable from his time as a prisoner. The ship crossed the Atlantic in early April when the ocean was still cold and gray. Hans stood at the rail watching America disappear behind him, and he felt something like grief. He was going home to his family, to his mother and sister who he loved, but he was also going home to a country that had been destroyed by the very ideas he once believed in. He wondered what he would find there, what Germany had become in the years since its total defeat. Other men on the ship talked excitedly about seeing their families again, about sleeping in their own beds, about eating their mother's cooking. Hans stayed quiet, watching the waves and feeling the weight of knowledge that could not be unlearned. The ship docked in Bremerhaven in late April of 1947. Hans walked down the gangway carrying his bag and stepped onto German soil for the first time in nearly 3 years. What he saw made his stomach twist with sorrow and shame. The port city was a landscape of ruins. Buildings stood like broken teeth, their walls collapsed, their windows empty holes staring at nothing. Rubble was piled in mountains along every street. The smell of dust and decay hung in the air. People moved through the destruction like ghosts, thin and gray and defeated. Children with hollow cheeks and enormous eyes begged near the dock, their hands outstretched for food or coins or anything at all. Old women pulled wooden carts loaded with salvaged bricks or bits of metal they hoped to trade. Everyone looked hungry. Everyone looked tired beyond measure. Hans took a train toward Hamburg, but the journey that once took 4 hours now took 2 days because so many tracks had been destroyed and not yet repaired. The train crawled through a devastated landscape. Cities were reduced to rubble. Factories stood as burnt shells. Bridges had collapsed into rivers. Fields that should have been planted lay empty and overgrown. At every station, desperate people crowded the platforms trying to board trains that were already packed beyond capacity. Hans saw a woman holding a baby that did not cry, and he realized the child might be dead. He saw men missing limbs, probably soldiers like himself, begging for food with empty tin cups. He saw former Nazi officials trying to blend into the crowds, their uniforms gone, their arrogance replaced by fear. Hamburg was worse than he had imagined. The city he remembered from childhood had been beautiful, with grand buildings and busy streets and shops full of goods. Now it was a moonscape of destruction. The Allied bombing had been so complete that whole neighborhoods had ceased to exist. His family's apartment building was still standing, though damaged, and he climbed the stairs with his heart pounding. When his mother opened the door and saw him, she made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob. She looked 20 years older than when he had left. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her face was lined and thin. Her hand shook as she reached for him. His sister Maria came out of the small kitchen and stopped, staring. She was 19 now but looked like an old woman, her body thin as a skeleton, her eyes sunken deep. She wore a dress made from an old curtain because there was no fabric to buy. Her feet were wrapped in cloth because she still had no shoes. When Hans opened his bag and gave her the chocolate bars, She held them like they were made of gold and began to cry. His mother cried too when he gave her cigarettes. Not because she smoked, but because cigarettes could be traded for food or medicine or anything they needed. That first night, Hans lay on the floor of the apartment because there was only one bed and his mother and sister needed it more. He listened to the sounds of the ruined city outside, people digging through rubble, voices calling in the darkness, the distant sound of machinery trying to clear streets. He thought about the Christmas dinner at Camp Shelby, about the abundance he had seen every single day in America, about the waste and the plenty and the casual generosity. The contrast was so sharp it felt like a knife in his chest. His family had suffered terribly, while he had been safe and well-fed. Germany had brought this destruction on itself, through its mad pursuit of conquest and racial purity. And now everyone paid the price. In the months and years that followed, Hans found work as a teacher in the new Federal Republic of Germany that rose from the ashes. He taught history and civics to young people who needed to learn a different way of thinking. He never spoke directly about his time in America, understanding that some truths were too painful for people still struggling to survive. But he taught his students to question authority, to demand evidence, to think for themselves. He taught them that freedom and diversity created strength, not weakness. He taught them that democracy was not perfect, but it was better than tyranny. He spoke carefully about the dangers of propaganda, about how lies could poison an entire nation if people did not remain vigilant. As he grew older, Hans kept his diary in a locked box. Sometimes he took it out and read through the pages, remembering the young man he had been and the transformation he had undergone. In the 1990s, when Germany was reunited and the Cold War had ended, Hans was interviewed by a historian studying the experiences of German prisoners of war. He was an old man then, his hair white, his hands twisted with arthritis. But his mind was clear and his memory was sharp. He told the historian about the Christmas dinner in 1944. About the moment when everything he believed had shattered. He said the most shocking thing about America had not been the wealth or the power or the abundance. It had been humanity, the simple, decent treatment of enemies who had done terrible things. He said that shocked him more than any weapon could have, and it taught him what true strength was. True strength was not the power to destroy, but the power to remain decent even in war. To treat even your enemies with basic human dignity. Hans said he carried that lesson home with him in 1947, wrapped up with the chocolate and the cigarettes and the baseball glove. That lesson, multiplied by thousands of prisoners who learned the same thing, had helped rebuild Germany not as conquerors, but as a free democratic people. The most devastating defeat had not come on any battlefield. It had come at a dinner table, where abundance and mercy had shattered the lies of an empire built on hatred and shown a better way forward. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.